بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين. In 1944, there was an organization established with the purpose to provide financial help for those economies that are stumbling. And this organization consisted of 189 member countries. As you might have guessed, this is the International Monetary Fund. With the greatest shareholder being the US with 18% of stake in it, which means they are also the most significant decision makers within that organization. Also, there are other big countries like Germany, France, Japan, and the Great Britain, where they have about 20%. So 38% is only with these countries, the decision making within the hands of these countries. In their side, the International Monetary Fund say that their purpose is to secure financial stability, promote employment, promote economic growth, and also reduce poverty. But is this true? In order to answer this question, let's go 23 years back, most specifically in 1997, when the Asian crisis happened, with the countries like Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia, and Malaysia. These countries, they had short-term loans from other countries, and in order to help their economies. At the time, Indonesia had about 11% poverty rate before the Asian crisis, and South Korea had the unemployment rate at 3%. Now, what happened is that they were unable to commit to these loans, and because of that, many international investors, they panicked, and therefore a lot of their international currencies had a capital outflow from these countries. Due to this panic, there was a devaluation of the local currencies. Now, in order to understand how this devaluation occurred, let's look into the classical supply-demand curve. So let's assume that this is the supply-demand curve of one of the international currencies in one of the Asian countries. And if we look at this, we can see that the price in local currency for that international currency is P1. And because of the issue that happened, because of the issue of the capital outflow, this supply curve moved left. So it had a left movement, and therefore, since the supply of this currency, of the international currency, reduced, now we have a new equilibrium point, and at this point, we see that the price P2 has increased, which means the local currencies' purchasing power of other currencies had decreased. In other words, it was a devaluation of the local currency. Now, this devaluation of the local currency exerted a lot of pressure on the Asian countries, and that's why the Asian crisis. Now, who came into picture? The International Monetary Fund came into picture to help these countries. Now, of course, any loan provided by the International Monetary Fund would be actually on conditions. So there are certain conditions that the countries need to accept in order to get that loan. And that condition is about some economic reforms, structural reforms within their economies, or that's what we might have thought at the beginning, or these countries were thinking. So what happened is that they asked these countries to cut spending. And cutting spending means they have to reduce a lot of subsidization of their own resources like energy and other things. And this means unemployment will occur because the public sector, when they cut spending from the public sector, they will have to actually reduce the workforce within the public sector. And this means tens of thousands of workers will be out of work. And of course, at the time, Malaysia refused to adhere to that, and they thought that by controlling the capital, they would be able to stop or eliminate the speculative pressure on their own currency. The IMF mocked Malaysia for that decision, and the other countries like South Korea and Indonesia took the loan. But then what's the result? Indonesia, which had 11% poverty rate, the rate increased after the IMF loan and after these reforms increased from 11% to 40% and to 60%. South Korea, what happened? The 3% unemployment increased to 10%, and this led to the what was known at the time IMF suicides. The workers who lost their job, they committed suicide because of that. One might say, okay, that was in 1997 and the IMF has learned from that picture. But the thing is, let's take another example. If we look at the number of years that these countries that took the IMF loans, the number of years they spent with these loans and how many times they have retaken the loans, we can see that about 70 countries depended on IMF for more than 10 years. 11 of them depended on the IMF for more than 30 years. 4 of them depended on the IMF for more than 40 years. Okay. Another example is Haiti. Haiti took the loan, and due to that loan, they were actually forbidden, or they were asked to stop or to cut the spending, to cut the governmental spending, and also to cut any subsidies for their own agricultural products. And at the same time, subsidized US rice was flooding the Haiti markets. 50% of this rice was provided by the US to Haiti. But in reality, IMF actually favors corporate welfare. The IMF in 2012 did some more reforms by providing economic indicators in order to correct their measures within the countries that were taking the loans. But did these reforms work, or was it only on paper? So the thing is, we can take a new example. In 2017, Ecuador took loans from the IMF with the condition to cut spending, governmental spending. Again, it's cutting governmental spending and increasing taxes. So this is what happened, is that we had more than or tens of thousands of jobs lost from the public sector. Now, the reason they say they need to cut spending in all these examples is that they're looking at not having the money transferred from the private sector to the public sector, because the public sector is less efficient than the private sector. So they're thinking that keeping the money in the private sector would be more efficient, and this will drive the economic growth. The recipes are for disaster, and it's an intended recipe for disaster, because there are two things worth noting. First, the international monetary recipes for all these countries were fiscal policy contractions, while this kind of recipe for the economies was used in the US from 1950s to the 1970s or something around that. But later, after that, the US economies were depending more on the monetary policy rather than the fiscal policies. So why does the IMF insist that these countries use the fiscal policy to correct their economies and produce economic growth? Of course, there is a reason, and I would like to see your comments below. The second point we need to note is that this reminds me of the Jews long time back, before Islam even, when the Jews were asked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Torah not to devour riba or usury. So in order to deceive and play around it, they said, okay, we will not take usury from among us, but we will take it from others. And their intention was to take it and increase the usury until someone who's actually taking the loans from them to go bankrupt. So please let me know in the comments below, why do you believe the IMF was established? Was it for bailing out economies, or because they want to have a political grip over these countries and the US to thrive on the economies of others? Well, thank you for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.